And this morning I want to talk about the teaching of the greatest apostle of all, teaching that came from Jesus himself while he was here. And many of you know that over the last few weeks we've been considering the kingdom. For me, it came out of a time of being in the prayer room and constantly praying, Lord, let your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And I'm like, I don't even think I know what I'm praying. What do I mean when I say, your kingdom come? That took me back to consider, what do I mean by kingdom? And so over the last few weeks we've been looking at that. We looked at an overview of what we mean by kingdom, i.e. that we are living under the rule of a king. It's his kingdom, it's Jesus' rule and reign. He is the kingdom, he brings the kingdom exists in him. And so where he is, there his kingdom is also. And so that's a quick summary of the first week. And then last week we looked at this whole idea that it is a mystery. That in Matthew 13, Jesus talks about this mystery of the kingdom. He therefore talked about the kingdom in parables. He chose to reveal what the kingdom was through parables because they were a mystery. And we looked last week at how that is because when Jesus came, the mindset and the paradigm that the Jewish people had at his coming was based on all the Old Testament prophecies that spoke of this cataclysmic event, particularly seen in Daniel 2, where this little stone comes and destroys all the other kingdoms and sets up his own kingdom as a mountain. And so what the Jewish people were expecting when the kingdom came was for all the kingdoms of the world to be crushed as God's kingdom took its place. And what Jesus came to share was that actually there is a mystery behind that kingdom, that it actually doesn't come as one great cataclysmic event, but that it came when he came to inaugurate it, and it wouldn't actually be completed until his second coming. And through these parables, we see the nature of that kingdom being unfolded. And so that's what you want to look at this morning. There are 7 parables, and then an 8th parable stroke instruction to the disciples, and we're going to make our way through that. So if you want to have your Bibles open, we're in Matthew 13. And we're going to make our way through each of the parables and look at what Jesus said. And this morning I was sitting in bed going through my message. And I said to myself, oh no, I want to put this in now as well. And I have to say, I could have probably gone on with so much more from each of the parables, but I want us to see them as a whole because Jesus delivered them as a whole, because there is something about the progression through them that we need to take hold of. And then you can all go off for yourselves and look at them in detail and take time to talk to God about them and meditate on them as you go. So the first one is the parable of the sower and the seed. And Jesus spoke this parable to the whole crowd. So as we said last week, what he did was he came to the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd came. And we read it in the first 3 verses. It says, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. So they were staying in this house, and he came out and sat beside the sea. When Jesus sat down, the people knew that he was about to teach. We have a very strange situation in our culture, I think, in that when someone comes to preach, they stand up. But actually, in the Hebrew culture, you sat down and you gathered everyone around you because you interacted. And as you know, most of you know that when we teach at home, we love that setting of where we can just sit and gather people around. That's the Hebraic way of teaching. And so when Jesus sat, the people knew that he was going to share something. That's what they knew. That was the sign that the rabbi was about to share. And so this great crowd gathered about him. And it was so big that he decided he needed to actually have a sort of amphitheatre type environment. No microphones and speakers here, guys. That wasn't possible. So he got into a boat and he sat down. And the whole crowd then stood on the beach so that they could hear what he was saying. And it says he told them many things in parables. And the first parable is this parable of the sower and the seed that he speaks to this crowd. And in it, what we'll see is him describing how the crowds would respond to his teaching. And he illustrates it by 4 different types of responses that people make to the preaching of God's reign, of the kingdom. We need to understand this. Jesus was talking about the kingdom, about the rule and the reign of Jesus. He wasn't talking about how you can have a better life. I want us to get hold of that, because we need to understand what the message is. The message is the message of the kingdom. It's about Jesus' rule and reign, and whether you will accept that rule in your life. And what he does is he uses 4 different types of soil to describe the response. Now, what we have to understand is that he's talking to a rural community. Many of them, if they weren't farmers, they'd be very familiar with how farmers went out and scattered the seed as they walked through their fields. No machineries, a bowl of seed, a basket of seed, walking through the field and scattering it. And Jesus also then interpreted that to his disciples. So he told the parable to the crowd. He didn't interpret it to the crowd. And I think, I've just been thinking about that a little bit. And the point was that he told that and the following 3 parables to the crowd. But that first parable was really so the disciples would understand how that crowd was going to respond. And so he interprets it to the disciples later on so that they know what will happen. So let's just read the parable first of all. Let's go on from verse 4. Halfway through let's go from verse 3. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they didn't have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So what we see is that some fell on the path, where the birds ate them before they were germinated, so there was nothing. Some seed fell on stony ground. Sorry, I've just lost my voice. Some seeds fell on the stony ground, and that meant they grew up quickly because they were in shallow topsoil. But because it didn't have deep roots to get the necessary moisture, it dies. It's a bit like we've got a rockery, and sometimes things start to grow on the rocks, but they don't last. They try and come up, and then they just wither away because there's no soil to go into. And then others, which we get a lot of in our garden, came up amongst thorns, amongst the weeds, and the bushes and the weeds overtook them. We have this awful thing. What's it called, Mike? That horrible mare's tails. We've got this horrible thing called mare's tails in our garden. And if I don't get them out straight away, they can grow into a great big bush and they just kill off and suffocate anything else that's trying to grow amongst them. And that's a bit like what was happening here. They completely get squashed, they get overwhelmed. And those weeds take all the nourishment and the light, and so the plant that was intended to grow dies. And of course the final ground that he talks about is this good ground, which produces a really good crop. And in each case, the seed is the same, all right? There's no different seed, it's the same seed. It's the word of the kingdom. But the difference is in the receptivity of the soil or the heart response of each person, which heard the message of the kingdom. It's often called the parable of the sower, and it really shouldn't be. It should be called the parable of the soil, because the soil is the thing we need to focus on. And what Jesus is saying is the mystery is that the kingdom is here. The sower is here, Jesus, with the seed. So he's standing there delivering the seed, but it's not yet. It doesn't yet carry that irresistible power that Daniel 2 described, where it will destroy wicked governments. That's the mystery, that the king is here with the kingdom, but it's the word of the kingdom that's going out at the moment, and that word will have different responses. It will fall on different soil. And so what he's trying to explain is that this is going to be about what happens in individual people, not about what's going to happen across the earth at this point. And so in Matthew 13:18 to 23, Jesus goes on to explain the parable to his disciples. And in it he tells us that the seed is the word of the kingdom, which is the good news of salvation from sin, death and Satan. And it's life in an eternal kingdom under the rule of Jesus. And that's what we've been looking at. We looked in the last few weeks as to what this kingdom was. Because if Jesus is sharing the word of the kingdom, we need to know what it is he's speaking about. And of course, first and foremost, the word of the kingdom is himself. He is the word. And so that's why I wanted to do the previous 2 weeks, because the word that is being shared, the seed that is being shared, is the word of the kingdom that we have looked at in previous weeks. And it is Jesus. And so the seed falls on these 4 different types of soil, which speak of the different responses. So let's just read verses 19 to 23. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom. Now I want to make clear, you can't hear something that isn't spoken, that isn't said, that isn't declared. So if we are sharing the kingdom, the only way we can share it is by speaking of it. Jesus says it's the word of the kingdom. So just doing good works just doesn't actually, there's a real feeling out there, isn't there? Well, we just need to love others and they'll see the kingdom. No, they'll see our love, but we need to explain where that love comes from, and we need to declare the kingdom, and we need to make it clear that there is a king, that people need to make the decision to place their lives under his authority and rule. So, when that word is shared, he says, and anyone hears the word of the kingdom, you can't hear something that's not spoken, anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it. So our responsibility is to share the word, to speak it, but we can't make people understand it. And Jesus couldn't make people understand it. Depending on who they are, depends whether they understand it. And if they haven't understood it, Jesus says the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. And this is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So the seed that fell on the... Sorry, can I just a moment? Yeah, okay, that's fine. So the seed that falls on that stony ground, the birds come and eat it up quickly. Stony place, the seeds fall on the stony ground, it sprouts up, and there's this great joy. There's a joyful response. But they quickly fall away because it didn't have any understanding. It didn't have any deep or genuine. It didn't impact. There was great joy. Oh, this is something I can be part of. Often I think that's, people see a community of God's people. They hear the message. They want to be part of that. There's great joy at coming in, but they're not discipled. The roots don't go down deep. And so they quickly fall away. And the same is true for those in the thorns. Seeds that fell among the thorns, they get choked out. They get choked out by anxiety of the world, or the seduction of riches, or the world becomes more attractive than the kingdom again. And so there isn't a real understanding of the kingdom. And so they don't produce the fruit. And then you get that good soil, the seed that fell on good ground, that produces that extraordinary crop. A 10-fold yield was considered a really good crop. So imagine 30, 50, 100-fold. So what we see are two groups that made a profession of faith that actually later turns out to be very superficial. They began well, but they failed to continue to follow the Lord. So whether they were saved or lost, that's not the point that I want to really look at in this parable. What matters most is not a person's profession of faith, but their perseverance in the faith. Because what we saw in the first group is that group that Satan just immediately strips it away, because it is the enemy who's at work here. He doesn't want us to get a revelation of the kingdom. And so as we share the message of the kingdom, we need to realize, and this is why Jesus shared it with the disciples. He's saying to them, realize that responses are going to be very different. You're going to get those who hear it, but the devil just steals it away. The first obstacle to seeing people come to a revelation of the kingdom is Satan himself, who wants to snatch the word of the kingdom from our hearts, from those who hear it, so they don't even respond. But we need to also stand in the second, those external pressures of affliction and persecution, or the shallowness of the response, are all going to mean that people will fall away. And we all have friends who have professed faith but no longer do. And it's God who judges what the nature of that is. But what I would say is we need to continue. We really need, and I think there will be many who made a profession of faith on the wrong message. And these days we need to make sure they are hearing the message of the kingdom so that they can make a response and come under Jesus' rulership. And that's the fourth type, who will hear it. And they will have varying different degrees of fruitfulness. Some will bring much fruit, some will bring in a little. But it's all fruit. And so what we now see is that Jesus now goes on to tell other parables to elaborate on this first one, to help us understand even more what is going on. So the next one we're going to look at, the parable of the wheat and the tares, will explain how there are hypocrites and heretics in the church. All right, those who profess faith but don't have faith. And the third and the fourth parables, which are the mustard seed and the yeast, they're going to show us how the kingdom advances. The fifth and the sixth will show us the value, and the seventh will reinforce that parable of the wheat and tares that we're going to look at now, showing the importance of the truth that both grow up together. So let's look at the wheat and the tares. Let's just read that. I'm conscious we may go a little longer this morning because we're having to read so much scripture. But we do need to read it because I want us to be clear about what Jesus really said, because most of these parables we think we know, but we need to see what Jesus really said. So Jesus again says, verses 24 to 30, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servant of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So we see again that Jesus is just telling the parable. He isn't explaining it. But he is talking here about two different seeds. So he's just told them a parable about the kingdom of heaven and the seed that the sower sows. And now he goes on to say, but that sower's sown seed, but another comes and sows a different seed amongst it. So it's a progression. It's not a different, it's a progression of that parable. And it addresses, this parable actually will go on as he explains it to the disciples to describe the delay of judgment. Because what he says is, both get there and they want to root out the thing that is bad. And he says, no, it's all going to grow and it will get separated at the harvest. And so what he is explaining is that it's not until the harvest that which the enemy sowed and that which the sower sowed actually get separated out. And I think this is one of the most difficult things that many people struggle with in Jesus' teaching. That we are not to separate out the wheat from the tares. Because this will actually be delayed until the end of the age. And Jesus in this, of course, is explaining why he is not going to destroy the wicked Roman oppressors. They have been sown in amongst the people. Those oppressors have been sown in amongst his people. The Romans are there in the land. The enemy has brought them in amongst them. But he's not going to overcome them at this point. That judgment will come at the end of the age. And it will come upon those Roman oppressors because they will be raised to judgment. And so the interpretation that he then gives his disciples later on is in verses 37 to 43. So let's read that. So he says, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. How many times have you heard a sermon on the parable of the sower and the seed and not heard it followed up by the parable of the wheat and the tares? And yet they have to come together. Otherwise we will not understand what is going on, and we will not understand the days in which we are living. Jesus is very clear. I mean, it's probably one of the most clear descriptions of a parable laid out before us. Jesus clearly says the good seed represents believers in Jesus, while the sons of the Son of Man, while the tares are the sons of Satan. You see, what we see here is the righteous and the wicked are defined by their family relationship. Each person is either a son of the kingdom that belongs to God, or they're a son of the devil whose desire is to deceive and to destroy God's work. The fact is that it's often difficult to distinguish the sons of the evil one from the sons of the kingdom. Wheat and tares, when they begin to grow, look very alike. It's not until they bear their fruit that you can tell the difference. And so in immaturity, you can't tell the difference between a son of God and a son of the enemy. It's only as we begin to bear fruit that you can tell the difference. And even then, it's not our responsibility to separate them out and to try and destroy that which is of the enemy. And Jesus says that the field is the world. So this is clear that it's a global mission to sow this seed. It goes beyond Israel. He says to the disciples, it is the world. It doesn't say it's Israel. So he's very clear that the kingdom is actually going to be seeded throughout the world, and it will grow up around the world, and the enemy will plant his seed around the world until across the world there is a harvest to be brought in that is a mixed harvest. You see, the problem is that the tares are so closely intermingled that if we're not careful, if we try and take up something which is evil, we might pull out something that is good because they are so closely intertwined. And so we have to leave that to God. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't address evil fruit where we see it, but we don't destroy it. It's not our job to try and destroy it. In other words, what Jesus is saying is you don't go to war to kill the people that are doing the birth. I will come and bring that judgment. God's going to permit righteous and wicked to coexist, but he will separate us when he comes to judge. And actually, it's very clear what happens when he comes to judge. Those are of his family will know eternal joy and will live in the light. Those are of the enemy's family will go to eternal destruction, to the lake of fire. Okay. So then he goes on, and we won't go into, it takes so long to do the other ones. The first two are the ones we really need to get hold of, because then he begins to talk about the nature of the kingdom. So he compares the kingdom to a mustard seed and a lump of yeast. And what we'll see in this is that the kingdom will grow from very insignificant beginnings to something much greater, with greater influence. The manifestation of God's reign starts with Jesus and this small group of uneducated disciples. And the parable of the mustard seed highlights the unforeseen character of the kingdom as starting much smaller than most would thought it would be. I used to think of that little band of ragtail disciples. It started very small. And what Jesus once again is addressing the misunderstanding and explaining the mystery, that it's not kind of come as one cataclysmic event. It's coming as a little tiny mustard seed. And for that reason, the kingdom can very easily be dismissed. So let's just read it, 31 to 32. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. So what we see there is it's a tiny little seed, but what it grows into is this great big, so the fruit is going to be great, and it will provide shelter and all that sort of stuff that we've talked about. But I want to focus in on the key issue here, that what Jesus is explaining is the kingdom is going to be so tiny that many, to start with, that it may be dismissed. It won't be understood. And then he goes on to say the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Most of you know I love making bread, and if you make bread with yeast, leaven is yeast. If you've ever seen what happens, you put it in and then within an hour it's doubled in size. And so this is what he's saying. It will start off as something insignificant in amongst everything else, but it will grow. And that parable is very similar to the one of the mustard seed, obviously, but it emphasises the initial smallness and unimpressiveness of the kingdom compared to what it will eventually become. And so Jesus compares the growing of the kingdom to something that is invisible and imperceptible. So the mustard seed is tiny, but you gradually see it growing. But the leaven is just hidden in the flour, and yet something is growing that is not really yet understood. And what Jesus is saying to his disciples, it may look very tiny, but be assured it will grow into something so much better. That there is a glorious kingdom to come. And they're there to encourage believers, to encourage us, to remember that what God is doing in this present phase of the kingdom is going to grow. He has told us it will grow. And in contrast to what some thought the kingdom would be, it's actually going to be incredibly glorious. From these little tiny beginnings, the kingdom will not be quenched, it will survive, and it will expand into international proportions, bringing light to the nations before the end of the age. And then Jesus goes on to tell the parables, and they're all coming in pairs. I hope you realise that. You know, there's the seed parables, the first two. There's the mustard seed and the leaven, which are about the growth of the kingdom. This one is about, the next two are about the value of the kingdom. Let's just read those verses. 44 to 46. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. So as we see, these are about the value of the kingdom. And that its value, and what we see here is that the value of the kingdom is hidden to many. This is to encourage the disciples again. But what he then goes on to make clear is that kingdom is so valuable that it's worth sacrificing anything for our participation in it. But the problem is that that value is hidden. It's not obvious to everybody now. It's not like offering a bar of gold and you can see the value. It's offering an invitation into a kingdom, which until you dig into it and find out more of what that kingdom brings, you don't see the value of it. Until you gain understanding of the kingdom, you don't see its value. So in the first one, we see that treasure is found by chance. It seems that without that man looking for it intentionally, he comes across it. And in the surprise of it all, he's shocked, and there's this happy response of great joy because he realises the value of what he's found. And he goes and sells his field, and joy floods his heart because he stumbled on this kingdom, this great value. But in the second one, we see someone who is searching for something of great value, for fine pearls, which was actually one of the most precious commodities in the ancient world. And this merchant's life had been bound up with pursuing this most precious of earthly objects. And now he comes across one singular pearl of such beauty, of such great value. This is the one who is searching, trying to find the thing that is of value. And finally they come across the kingdom. And they too are then so overjoyed that they give up everything for that. I think it's the kindness of Jesus that he shows us the two. Those who come into a revelation of the kingdom by accident almost, because they stumble across something. They stumble across you and me. Or they happen to suddenly hear someone preaching on the streets. Out shopping, not even thinking about it. Hear the message and respond. And then there's those who are searching in every other place, all the other religions, all the other ways, until they actually take the time and they find this kingdom. But in both there is so much joy, so much excitement, so much response that it's worth giving up everything else for. If we truly find the kingdom, we will give up everything because we have to come under his rulership. Philippians 3 verse 8, Paul says, "Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ." When we come across the treasure, the pearl, there is so much joy and such a revelation that we step into the kingdom, we pledge allegiance to Jesus, and we give up everything else. Okay, and the final parable which we'll look at, which is the one of the net. Verses 47 to 50. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, interestingly, these previous two parables of this one, Jesus is only speaking to his disciples, so he gives the explanation straight away. And don't you love that he uses the fishing net to the fishermen? He wants them to understand. And this parable really does connect back, obviously, to the one of the wheat and the tares, because once again we have good and bad fish. And what we need to see is that the judgment now, Jesus is making it clear who it is that actually comes and brings that judgment. It's the angels who come and gather it all up. And it's the Son of Man who is the judge, who has the right to determine the destiny of both the righteous and the wicked. That punitive judgment is said to include all who have stumbling blocks or who are guilty of wickedness. Do you see that? It's those who cause God's people to stumble, and those who have lived lives of wickedness are those who are taken out. We have to understand that it isn't just about personal character, it's also about the negative influence on others that the wicked have. The reason that God judges them so severely is not just because they haven't come under his rule, but because they've caused his children to stumble. But what this does show us is that there will be those who profess to be Christians, those who associate with the kingdom, who are not all genuine believers. And both will continue until the end and be evaluated according to their true character. The Lord will remove the wicked in his timing, but the righteous will continue to enjoy the kingdom that they have come into, sharing in his glory. Having been faithful through the now, they will share